Welcome to the 2021 Canadian virtual launch of the Ready to Print exhibit, Stars Without a Heaven, Children in the Holocaust. My name is Fran Sunshine, and I am the National Chair of the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem. It's my pleasure to be with you here. This exhibition is dedicated to the unique stories of children during the Holocaust. During a period when Jewish communities underwent social and familial upheaval, children living in this reality essentially lost their childhood. The drawings, poems, letters, and toys displayed in this exhibition demonstrate the unique capacity of children to hold on to the forces of life, creativity, imagination, and optimism, despite facing dire circumstances. Tonight, videos from Yad Vashem experts and resources for educators on this exhibit are available for the very first time in Canada. This launch is an incredible opportunity for students, educators, and people of all backgrounds to learn about an important area of the Holocaust. This exhibit and the launch tonight provides an opportunity to learn about all of the Yad Vashem ready-to-print exhibits that are available for display in schools and public locations across Canada. For more information on how to get these displays into your community, click on the links in the website. Thank you to all of our partners in the project: Maspeak, JNF Canada, Edmonton Jewish Federation, Hamilton Jewish Federation, Ottawa Jewish Federation, and the Israel Embassy of Israel in Canada.
Hello to everybody from Jerusalem. My name is Noam Gittin, and I'm the head of the Overseas Groups and Young Leadership section at Yad Vashem. And I'm honored to guide you today through one of the amazing ready-to-print exhibits that were funded by the Canadian Society for Yad Vashem. The exhibit that we're going to be touring today is called Stars Without a Heaven, which deals with the world of children during the Holocaust. Before we dive into the exhibit itself, I'd like us to reflect for a second on the title of this exhibit. The word stars here is used in comparison to God's promise to Abraham that his descendants will be like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. But the title alludes to the fact that there's a difficulty. What is the fate of the stars if there's no heaven? What is the fate of the children? How can the children exist if they don't have everything that they need in order to exist? The world that we wish for our children, for all children, is a world that's safe and peaceful and innocent. And in this world, evil magically is non-existent or is very, very far off in the distance. There's nothing more contrasting to this world that we aspire to provide the children than the world of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And the utter wickedness of the final solution is never clearer to us than when we're confronted with the methodical mass murder of those children. Children during the Holocaust lost their childhood. And in those moments where they were allowed to be children, they behaved like children. They laughed and they played and they sang and they wrote stories and they drew their worst fears and their hopes and their desires. And it's these toys and drawings and diary entries and poems that are exhibited within this exhibit that allow us a glimpse into this fascinating world of children during the Holocaust. So let's begin with the basics, with, first of all, defining what the Holocaust is. What we can see here in front of us is a definition of the Holocaust as given by Yad Vashem. The Holocaust, Shoah, was an unprecedented genocide, total and systematic, perpetrated by Nazi Germany and its collaborators with the aim of annihilating the Jewish people, culture, and traditions from the face of the earth. The primary motivation for the Holocaust was the Nazis' anti-Semitic racist ideology. Between 1933 and 1941, Nazi Germany pursued a policy of increasing persecution that dispossessed the Jews of their rights and property, and later branded and concentrated the Jewish populations under their rule into designated areas. By the end of 1941, the policy had developed into an overall comprehensive systematic operation that the Nazis called the final solution of the Jewish question. These policies gained broad support in Germany and across much of the European continent. Nazi Germany designated the Jews of Europe and eventually the rest of the world for total extermination. Alongside the mass extermination of millions by shooting, millions of Jews from all over the world were rounded up and deported on freight trains to extermination camps, industrial facilities in which they were gassed to death. By the end of World War II, in 1945, some 6 million Jews had been murdered, among them approximately 1.5 million children. Only a small percentage of children survived the Holocaust. Yad Vashem has come to the understanding that the number 6 million is too large of a number for us to understand. But if we understand that 6 million represents 6 million personal stories, and if we take the personal story and combine it with the history, we get something that's much more tangible. But when it comes to the children, it's even more difficult because there's so few material objects left from the world of Jewish children during the Holocaust that allow us to illustrate what that world was. Adolfo Garcia Ortega, in his book, The Birthday Buyer, wrote the following: children leave almost no trace. They don't usually write letters and don't leave written or oral testimonies. They have friends, but they are also children. They live close to their families, to their parents and siblings. And if the adults disappear along with them, no one will ever consider them, even with a fleeting thought. And this leads us to the question of, if this is the case, then how do we tell the story of the children during the Holocaust? What this exhibit does is that we look at the world of Jewish children during the Holocaust through the prisms of childhood, education, family, home, friendship, play, all of these different prisms. And what we're going to try to do today is go through, give examples from different prisms and check if we see a change in these prisms between what we would expect to see there and how these prisms come about during the Holocaust. So the first prism that I want us to discuss today is that of family. It's important to understand that during the Holocaust, the nuclear family disintegrated. Parents could no longer protect their children, could no longer support their children, could no longer be that person who provided that safety that the children needed. And in many of the cases, we're talking about separation. Families were completely separated. Siblings were separated. Parents were separated from their children while being deported and eventually murdered. So the world of the children has been turned upside down. In many of the cases, the children themselves became the supporters, the breadwinners who could then provide for their family and for their siblings. In many of the cases, they became those people who had to take care of the family. But there were also cases in which they were completely left on their own and had to find a way to survive on their own in the big world. The story that I want to tell us here has to do with these two sisters. At the top corner, we can see the two sisters, Vera and Eva Zilberstein. The picture was taken in 1939. These two girls were from Bratislava, which as of March 1939 became the capital of the independent state of Slovakia. The Jews of Bratislava were the first Jews in Slovakia to have to suffer the new anti-Jewish measures, which ultimately led to the ghettoization of the Jews. And the Zilberstein family moved into the ghetto with the rest of the Jews of Bratislava. Right before liquidation, the girl's mother, was able to find hiding places. She herself hid in one place while the girls hid in a different place. And somebody informed on the girls. The girls were ultimately caught and deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now I want to read to you what Eva Zilberstein says that happens thereafter. We arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau. My mother's words were ringing in my ears. How I was a big sister and I had to watch over her, Vera, in all situations. Then we were standing in front of a man who signaled me to go to the right and told my sister to go to the left. I wouldn't budge an inch without my sister. She was struggling with me and I needed a great deal of strength. I asked him, can I stay here with my sister? He responded, no, she has to go to school and you have to go to work. She turned around and said to me, see? In a split second, she broke free from me and ran. She ran away happy. I think that what I connect to when it comes to this story is the fact that I have two girls. And I can imagine a situation where I tell my older daughter to watch over her younger sister, and they have a fight where the younger sister doesn't want the older sister holding her hand and so on. So I can completely imagine this normal scenario. The only problem is that this normal scenario doesn't take place in a normal world. It's not taking place in the mall or on the street or on the way to school. It's taking place in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And Vera, who was so happy to break away from her sister, doesn't realize or doesn't take in the significance of where they are or of the moment. They have now been separated. One is going to be sent into forced labor, while Vera herself is running away happy, unaware of the fact that she will be taken to the gas chambers where she will be murdered. I just want to show one more thing that we have here in this panel, which I think is very, very interesting, which is one of the drawings that Vera painted or drew before her deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau. She was very much Zionistic, looking forward to the opportunity at some point, hoping, aspiring to move to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. And what we can see here is that she drew herself as a central figure, dressed like a pioneer girl in the land of Israel, surrounded by other pioneer girls. So it's very interesting, this drawing, because you can see that they're all wearing shorts, the way she envisioned that the girls dressed in the land of Israel. There's this beach ball, which kind of, to me, represents something fun, right? Israel is a place that's fun, but also maybe the fact that she knows that it's on the sea and there's sand and that it's a warm climated place. And we can see that the girls have tools in their hands, which means that these are girls who are working the land. Yes, this is what her expectation was. And I think that this drawing is amazing because, first of all, we can see that it was drawn by a little girl. And we can also understand that it captures an entire world of hopes and aspirations of a girl for a good future, for a happy future. And unfortunately, we know that none of what we see here in this drawing will come true and will happen for Vera Zilberstein. Okay, the second prism that I want to talk about is the prism that deals with children in hiding. It's important to understand that very few children survived the Holocaust. But from those children who survived, the absolute majority survived in hiding. Now, hiding has many faces to it. It could be that they were with the partisans. It could be that they were hidden in a cellar somewhere, or in a hole in the ground. But it could also mean that they took on a hidden, a false identity, and were either living with non-Jewish families, or in orphanages, or in monasteries. Okay, and the question that we see here, who am I think is a very, very important question, the question of identity. Because if we think about it just for a moment, all of us struggle with our self-identity, right? Our identity as our personal identity, but also our collective identity. Who am I is a question that we all ask ourselves from a very young age. I can tell you that I'm still asking myself this question, and I'm not really sure of the answer itself. So on the one hand, it's very relevant, this question, right? The fact that we're asking this question with regards to the Holocaust, though, adds more dimensions to it. And the story that I want to tell you has to do with a young girl whose name is Sarah Vershaviak. Sarah Vershaviak was born in Lvov in 1936. Both of her parents understood what was happening to the Jews of Lvov, and they found a Polish woman who they paid to take care of her, to hide little baby Sarah, before they were deported to Belzec and murdered there. Once the money stopped coming through, the Polish woman abandoned Sarah Vershaviak, and this little girl ended up wandering the streets of Lvov by herself, no food, no shelter, no clothes, nothing. As she was wandering the streets, she came upon a man who recognized her, and he took her to his home. He bathed her and he fed her and he gave her all the medical attention that she needed. And then he drove her hundreds of kilometers away to an orphanage in Krakow, where he claimed that she was a Polish girl whose parents had been killed in the bombings. And a short while after she was brought to the orphanage, a Polish couple, the Pilch couple, decided to adopt her, and they fell in love with her. They raised her and they loved her as if she was their flesh and blood. Very, very soon after they adopted her, it was clear to them that she was Jewish. She had dark hair, she had dark eyes. She did not look like a Polish child whose parents had been killed. But this made no difference to them. They loved her nonetheless. When the war was over, her grandfather was able to find her, and a struggle broke out between the couple, the Polish couple who wanted her to stay with them, and the grandfather that claimed that her rightful place was with him. This went to court, and the court ruled in the grandfather's favor, and he was granted custody. He took Sarah Vershaviak and put her in a Jewish orphanage in Krakow because he himself couldn't take care of Sarah. And this is a whole issue in and of itself, right? Because in many of the cases, the parents or the relatives that came back for their children couldn't take care of their children, whether it was because they didn't have the money or the means, or because of psychological trauma that they had endured. she runs back, she escapes from the orphanage. She went back to the Pirchs. And again, the grandfather came demanding his granddaughter. This went to trial again. The court once again ruled in the grandfather's favor. This time, what he did was he took her and put her on a boat and sent her to Palestine, to the land of Israel. This way, promising that he was severing the connection between Sarah Warszawiak and the Polish couple. They continued corresponding throughout the years, and she was in touch with them. But I think this story brings up a number of different questions that are important for us to think about. First of all, I want us to think about what it means for a child to go into hiding. Children were taken and had to assume a false identity. They had to learn their new name. They had to, in many of the cases, learn a new language. They had to get accustomed to eating new food. I can tell you from two girls that have very picky eaters, I can't imagine what it's like for a person who's used to eating one kind of food to get used to eating different types of food, to learn new prayers, to make new friends, to get used to an entire new way of living. Because in most of the cases, the Jews came from urban areas, and sometimes they end up living in villages or on farms. That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot to learn. That's a lot to take in a very short amount of time. And for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they had to make sure that they didn't give any clue to the outside world of what their true identity was. In many of the cases, especially when we're talking about the younger children also, they've forgotten their true identity. They don't remember their biological parents. And they find themselves living in homes where they love their new family. Their new family loves them. And yet they're being torn away from these families. Why? And the answer is that at that time, after the Jewish nation had suffered such tremendous losses, what was important was to bring these Jewish children back to the Jewish nation. At that time, nobody was thinking about the psychological trauma or consequences that these children were going to have to deal with. They were being pulled away from the only families that they knew and loved. In addition, I want us to think about the fact that a lot of these children, whether they went into church, into monasteries, or into orphanages, or into Polish homes, which are Catholic, understood instinctively that being Jewish is bad. And so they accepted this Christian identity. And for them to be forced to go back to a Jewish identity also had a traumatic factor with that. So we can see here what Sarah Warszawiak says. She says, what's more important, the identity I was born with or what I feel now? Okay, the next prism that I want us to look at is the prism of play. I think that it's interesting because it seems like play and Holocaust would be two conflicting concepts, right? Because in a normal world, play is a world of imagination, a world in which children create rules that they are the ones who, they're the ones who create the rules. They're the ones who decide how they're playing and what they're doing. So all of this in the world of the Holocaust exists when children play, the imagination, them creating the rules, all of that exists. But at the same time, play has another role. It's a role of emotional survival. It's kind of like a lifeline that was given to the children. What I want to do is I want to show you this story, which has to do with two brothers, Henryk Jurek Orlowski and Kazimierz Kazik Orlowski. These are two brothers who grew up in Warsaw in Poland. When, with the outbreak of the war, their father enlists into the army and disappears somewhere behind Soviet lines. When the ghetto itself is established, the two brothers and their mother forcefully are moved into the Warsaw ghetto. Their mother perishes while they were living in the ghetto, and their aunt was able to find a place for both boys to hide with a Polish woman named Mrs. Mieleszka, and she kept the boys in her cellar. And what's amazing is that these boys were extremely resourceful. They created an entire world of games in their minds. And I want to read to you what Uri Orlev, or Henryk Jurek Orlowski, said. Each of us had heroes and generals in his army. The first one to read a book and invite its hero into his army. Of course, my army had the most famous heroes. Then once, when mother told us the tale of Robin Hood, my brother jumped up and invited Robin Hood to be in his army before I could. From that point on, his army had General Robin Hood, and there was nothing I could do about it, much to my dismay. In Mrs. Mieleszka's cellar, I built us a palace where we lived with our wives. I was Tarzan, commander of the world, and my brother was Richard Grenadier. So we see that these boys basically, from paper, from tiny pieces of wood, from cloth that they found, little pieces of metal, started creating an army of toy soldiers. The boys moved from hiding place to hiding place. Eventually, they ended up in Bergen-Belsen. After their liberation, they went into abandoned German homes and would go to the children's room and look for toy soldiers, and this way increased their collection. So we can see here on the bottom this very amazing and interesting collection of toy soldiers. And the question here is really, what purpose did play have in their story? And we can see that on the one hand, it had the purpose of, keeping them busy, whether it was in the ghetto or while they were in hiding, but it also was a means of escaping the dire situation that they were in, the fear, the hunger, the loss, the longing for their mother, and so on. Okay, so until now, the different prisms that we looked at were all prisms that are relevant to our world today, right? Play exists today, family exists today, identity exists today. But here we have a prism that is new. We can see here a changing in the prisms, something that the Holocaust created that didn't exist, not before and not after the Holocaust. And this is the prism of child labor. We have to understand that children were forced to work as forced laborers in ghettos mainly, sometimes in extreme circumstances, also in camps and in other settings as well. The children understood that work meant freedom. They instinctively understood this, and they find themselves having to pull their leverage just side by side with adults in order to do what they had to do to survive. And the story I want to tell you here is of a young boy whose name is Thomas Geva. Thomas Geva was born in Germany. In 1939, his family moved to Berlin. His father fled to England, and when at some point the schools in Germany no longer allowed Jews to attend schools, he was forced to go work in the Jewish cemetery. So we already see that even at this early stage, and there's no ghettos in Germany, but even at this stage, he was forced to go out and work in the cemetery. In June of 1943, he and his mother were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. His mother was murdered there. He was sent into forced labor. He began working in a bricklaying factory. And in January of 1945, he was taken on a death march to Gross Rosen camp, and from Gross Rosen he went on to Buchenwald, and there he was liberated in April of 1945 by the Americans. When he was liberated, he was so weak that he couldn't leave the camp, and so he had to stay in the camp and recover. While he was recovering, he drew 79 drawings of he drew 79 drawings. Most of these drawings deal with Auschwitz and with kind of like daily life and the routine in Auschwitz. So what we can see here is one of these drawings. This is a drawing describing the work of the bricklayer. So you can see the different jobs that people had. You can see how the little bricks ultimately make up this big brick wall. He also, we can see here, drew a schedule showing the routine in the camp. So we can see the clock and what what the prisoners are supposed to do at any given time. So for instance, you can see here the prisoner waking up and they have to wash their face, they're getting dressed, they're eating, okay? And you can see here all of the different the daily routine of the prisoner. We also have his testimony, and what he says is the following. At precisely 5 a.m., the camp bell would shake us out of our warm, happy oblivion. Throughout the entire camp, thousands of bunk frames would begin to tremble. Human beings living on scant bread and hardly any water quickly dressed in their trousers and rushed towards the crowded latrines. They quickly finished their business and moistened their gnarled hands and shaven heads. Returning to the block, they stood in line to receive soup made from pine cones boiled in water. Later, we arranged our beds. By 6 a.m., the blocks were emptied out of inmates who clustered in work details. About 15 minutes later, the commando marched outside of the camp, past the orchestra stage, members of the block staff and people from the Mason School. At 3:45 p.m., columns of dirty, exhausted workers began to return to the camp. And the question here that I want to ask is, what are the chances of a child surviving in the camps? And the answer is very small. Most of the children that were sent to the camps were immediately sent to extermination. The few that passed the selection process and became forced laborers lost their childhood, and they were not treated as children, and the expectations were the same as the expectations from the adults. Our last story has to do with the prism of education. Even despite, I'd say, the harsh conditions of the Holocaust, we have Jewish organizations desperately attempting to enrich the world of the children, whether it's youth movements or libraries or underground schools, trying to create alternative frameworks, informal frameworks, in order to enrich the children's world and to fill up their time, to fill up their souls, and to fill up their minds. But we have to remember that not all the children were privileged enough to take part in education, because a child that was in hiding, especially under circumstances where they were physically hidden in a cellar and so on, couldn't go to school. Couldn't take part in one of these alternative frameworks. And so they would have to sit with their books and would have to teach themselves. They'd have to use their memory and constantly, repeat and recite things that they'd learned in the past. But there were children whose daily struggle to survive was a war on death, and they could not, under any circumstances, be bothered with study. And that's something that's very important to understand, that there were children who didn't study at all. Our story today is going to focus on the children's homes. Children's homes were created by Jewish organizations in order to take in children who either their parents couldn't take care of them or were orphaned. But during the Holocaust, there's another dimension that's added, which is either their parents have been deported or their parents have been taken into forced labor and can't take care of the children during the day when they're out of the house for so many hours. I want us to think for a moment what it means for a family to come to the situation where they make the decision to send their child away, where they come to the understanding that they can't provide the best life for their child, that staying with them is not in the best interest of the child. Look what they've been degraded to, what has happened to the family, how broken they are that they need to give this child over to somebody else to take care of. And how do you explain to a child that you're sending them away? You can imagine the tears, the heartbreak, both from the parents' side and from the children's side. These children were sent to the children's homes. The children's homes did everything in their power to try to fill their days and their souls and their minds by educating them, by taking them on trips, by feeding them and giving them everything that they need. And the parents really think, they gave their children hoping that this is exactly what would happen with the children, that these children would have a better life. The story that I want to tell you about has to do with a young boy whose name is Georgie Halpern. Georgie was only 3 years old when the Anschluss took place, when Vienna was annexed to Nazi Germany. The family fled to France. When they arrived in France, his mother became very ill. His father was taken into forced labor, and once France was occupied by the Germans in June of 1940, and they could no longer care for Georgie, and they had no choice, and they sent him to one of these children's homes. And he moved through a couple of different children's homes, all the while remaining in touch with his parents, writing them letters. They'd send him packages. And we can see here one of the letters. On the right, we can see the original letter, how amazing it is with all the colors and the drawings that he made. And on the left, we can see the translations. The letter is in French. So let's look. It's 11th of March, 1944. Dear Papa, I'm playing nicely with my friends and feel good. Are you feeling well? I'm third in a class of 8. Received 64.5 in arithmetic. We're studying writing, grammar, French history, geography, and nature. I sleep well. Every Sunday and Thursday, we take a walk if it's nice outside. They shaved my head. I'm ending this letter with a whole lot of kisses. And almost all of his letters have like thousands and thousands of kisses. Your son thinks about you a lot, and 1,000 kisses to Mama and Papa. His parents sent him to these children's homes, hoping that they could provide the safety that his parents could provide, that they could provide the stability, the food, the learning, the camaraderie, the friendships with all of the other children, everything that his parents were powerless to do at that time. And we can see that this letter is from the 11th of March. Less than a month later, on the 6th of April, 1944, this children's home in Izieu was taken over. The Germans went in and they took all of the children and deported them along with the teachers and staff to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where everybody was murdered. All that Georgie wanted was to be reunited with his family. That's all that he wanted. And his parents survived, refusing to believe that, refusing at least to accept that Georgie was murdered. And they made Aliyah, they moved to Haifa, never forgetting their son, constantly searching, hoping that maybe in some, with a miracle, their child had survived. And I think that this story really shows us the dilemmas where you think you're making the best choice for your child, and it proves to be disastrous, but there was no way that they could. And when we think about the Jews during the Holocaust and what we call choiceless choices, where they had to make these choices between bad options to begin with. I want to finish our tour with the last will and testament of an amazing girl. Her name is Dunya Rosen. She was 12 years old on June 23rd, 1943, when she wrote this. And this is what she says. Olena succeeded in obtaining for me a few sheets of paper and a small pencil. I've decided to write a diary and have asked Olena to give it to the first Jew that she meets when the war is over. I know for sure, deep in my heart, that I will not survive until the war ends. I hope that these words that I'm writing, shaking with fear, will live on after my demise. I want this diary to be a testimony to the pain and suffering that I endured. I want people to remember this horrific period as a passing nightmare. I don't know when, but I know for sure that better days will come and peace will prevail. I hope that many years from now, when life will have blurred the memory of this cruel time, when students will not be able to answer the question whether Hitler had a beard or a mustache, that my last words will take you back. I believe that these memories will teach you to love your friends and hate your enemies, to take revenge on and fight the enemies of humanity, of freedom, justice, and law. It's hard for me to write. Maybe I'm not talented enough. I do not know if I will be able to describe reality with my simple words. I do not know if I have enough colors in order to commemorate this reality, life and death, the storm, the struggle against evil, the cruelty, and the bitterness of my soul. I have no words, but I must write. I must. I want my words to connect me to you. I beg you not to forget those who are no longer living. You must avenge their deaths. I plead with you to erect a monument that will reach the heavens, so the entire world will see it. Not a statue of marble or stone, but a tower of good deeds. For I strongly believe that only such a memorial can guarantee a better future for you and your children. Dunya Rosen survived the Holocaust, even though she didn't believe that she would survive. She survived the Holocaust. She volunteered in Yad Vashem for many, many years, and I think that there's something so powerful about what she says here, because on the one hand, she's describing so eloquently the suffering and the despair, and she truly believed that she was not going to survive the war. And yet, through all that, she still has hope. She has a message of hope for us, that one day she knows that there will be peace, and one day the world will be a better place. And when that time comes, we will be ready to learn from her messages and what she has to say to us. So I hope that we can go on with Dunya's words and continue to learn from the messages of the victims themselves, the victims and the survivors and those people who were there. I hope that this window that opened up for us today into the world of children during the Holocaust has left you with lots of questions, with lots of thoughts. And I hope that this was meaningful for you. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. I wish you all the best.